Okay, continuing our module on assessment and abnormal psychology, assessment for psychopathology, we'll talk just briefly about behavioral and physiological assessment. There are just a few things that I wanted to share in addition to the readings in the book, and in some ways just to kind of give a bit more example and food for thought in terms of how psychologists track these types of things, and in some ways, ways that you may actually be able to track some of your own behaviors that you're interested in following up on. So behavioral self-monitoring, behavioral observation are two key tools. Really what those are referring to is either having a client monitor themselves or someone in their family. That's something that I would do often in terms of working with parents on child behavior problems, for example. We can also do behavioral observation with a clinician or an assistant who's actually observing the behavior of that client or someone, a student, for example, in a classroom. So these are really key behavioral analysis techniques. The idea of observing, monitoring behavior, kind of given different names depending on who's doing them. Self-monitoring, if it's a client themselves who's doing it, and then observation if it's someone else who's doing that for the client. And I think the book does a nice job of kind of talking about some of the different aspects that are involved in terms of behavioral self-monitoring and observation, giving some nice examples. I thought I would just kind of talk a bit more about that. So really, I think one of the key take-home ideas here is that with behavioral self-monitoring observation, it's a really important form of assessment data that we can get, and to me is really important in any assessment case or assessment and treatment case that I would be working with. We need to know what those behaviors or specific problems are, kind of target problems. We need to have those carefully defined. That's one of the first steps that is important to do in terms of an assessment process, especially behavioral assessment, is what is that target behavior that we're talking about? What does that look like? When does it come up? How would I know it if I saw it? So in a behavioral interview, we're asking a lot of questions to get more and more specific. So if we were talking with the parent and they said, Johnny just never pays attention, I would want to know more about that. What does that look like? Does that look like Johnny is really just like not looking at his materials, or does that mean Johnny's not at his desk or he's jumping around? Is he asleep? What does Johnny not paying attention really mean? And so defining that behavior is really critical for either self-monitoring or for client observation. And there's some different ways to do that. So once we have that behavior really carefully defined, we can decide how often we want to track that. We can have, if we're doing a special like an observation period, typically that's done just across one period of time. Like if I'm an outside clinician coming in and observing in a school or something, I don't have, I can't come in 5 days in a row. So I would be set up to observe maybe for half an hour, 45 minutes, or I would instruct a teacher or teacher's aide to be able to monitor for a certain period of time. Might also provide some records so that they could actually track across 5 days, because maybe that is important information. But we can track when events come up. There are ways to do that in terms of, again, on paper, you can have an app, you can use a spreadsheet. I showed that in a couple segments ago when I talked about a client and how we track very specific behaviors and actually graph those over time in terms of our outcome assessment. But with event recording, really all we're doing is we're defining our behavior. We're using some sort of metric of time. So I might track things, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and then mark down basically how many times that behavior is occurring within a given day. So this is maybe a point for you to think about. Is there anything that you are either thinking about or working on? Are there a behavior that you find maybe more problematic, or a behavior that you think is like maybe a goal that you'd like to actually track when that's happening? So some examples are, going on social media. That would be one. Like, how often are you checking Facebook? You can actually track the number of times you're doing that. It may be biting your nails. That's a common one that clients kind of bring in. It may be How often are you snacking in between watching these lecture videos? So that maybe is something that you want to track. And basically what you would do again is you would define the amount of time, maybe it's per day, maybe it's per hour, and you would basically just develop a little table or a spreadsheet like this, and you would just kind of do tick marks for how often that event is happening. So that would be something, that would be an example of event recording. So whatever behavior, we kind of, maybe it's snacking. I did snack quite a bit yesterday. So maybe 4 times snacking yesterday, maybe only once today would be how that would be tracked. With interval recording, it's a little bit different because we sort of break down things into a little bit more specific periods of time, a little bit more specific intervals, and we're then tracking the number of occasions of that behavior in that particular interval of time. So it's just a little bit more specific. We can track all intervals for a period of time, or we can do something called interval sampling, where basically we sort of mark down kind of different periods of the day where we want to track and take like 15-minute periods. And that allows us just to kind of narrow in and get maybe more of a sample of those times where the behavior may be occurring rather than trying to track everything. And that's just maybe a little bit easier than trying to mark down every time a behavior is occurring. I think you can see there that, there's some pretty sort of old school ways of tracking behavior in terms of self-monitoring or client observation. There are also newer apps and sort of newer tools that are coming out for self-monitoring and for observation. Different kind of tools for logging types of behaviors, different goals. So maybe you're someone who already does that for different things, like the tracking exercise. Before my bike accident, I was tracking all the times that I went bike riding, and I actually tracked my ride, but I would track kind of the number of times that I went for a ride. I would actually be able to compare that on a month-to-month basis or week-to-week basis. Maybe I would be interested in tracking something like how many times I'm eating vegetables, per day, per week, and I could track that. There's different apps that you can do that. I'm not going to promote any right here, but different apps that you can find that will do that. And there are different apps that are being advertised out there like Noom for weight loss that use these types of self-monitoring techniques. So this is a really basic kind of behavioral self-monitoring, but we can kind of expand our perspective a little bit and try to think a little bit more broadly in terms of tracking that behavior in context. And so this table is an example of doing that, where we're not just tracking whether the behavior is happening. I think I should mention here that you can track the duration of behaviors as well. So maybe I'm tracking my child's tantrums. I would track that the tantrum happened in that time period and mark how long it lasted. So that may be one way of doing my interval recording. But we can put some more information about the context here. And with observation, we'll have access to some of this, like we would be able to maybe understand the situation that the person was in. But with some of these things, it relies on a cognitive behavioral framework. Again, the idea of behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. And so that really relies on the person's perspective to kind of fill in some of these details. So we would track the day and time that thing happened, whatever behavior. We would track more information about the situation, and then what that person was thinking and feeling when that behavior came up. So if I were working with someone in substance use treatment and they were having, really their kind of behavior that they were looking at was maybe either drinking or smoking a cigarette or using an e-cigarette or something like that, and they wanted to cut down, they would be tracking kind of when that behavior was coming up. They would be tracking what situation they were in. So maybe it was, I had a break at work and I, went outside and used and vaped or something like that, or I got home after work and had a drink. And here's kind of what else is going on. They would also track the thoughts and feelings that were associated with that. So I really felt stressed out, and I felt like, I deserved a break. That would be a thought and a feeling that kind of went along with that type of situation in terms of smoking or drinking, maybe for some people. So this would kind of provide some more information in terms of self-monitoring that a clinician could use. And again, these things would be things that the clinician may be doing, in the very first part of an assessment session to kind of understand a client's insight and their awareness of these different behaviors. And also then as a very initial intervention step, actually, to train a client to train the person that they're working with to actually monitor their own behavior using a tool that the clinician is helping them to learn. So these again would be the first step for me in terms of working with the client to kind of start out, get their full picture, understand what the main target behavior problems are or target problems are. And then really after that first assessment session, provide them with some sort of monitoring tool where they can then take that home and then bring that back the next time we meet, so they can kind of show me what they learned about their behavior and the context over the past week, and understand different patterns that might have come up. And that's really sort of the next step in behavioral self-monitoring. So when we're looking at behavioral self-monitoring data, we're engaging in some ways in what's called a behavior chain analysis. I've mentioned this term before, but really we're kind of seeing how behaviors are linked in time. So different behaviors in that traditional behavior perspective we're trying to see. So for example, that person who is working on reducing their vaping or maybe stopping their vaping, that's maybe been a health goal for them. And so maybe their behavior is that they go outside during a work break, they vape, and then what happens next? Or kind of some series of events that we're tracking. And so the vaping would be the behavior. We're sort of looking at what's kind of coming up before and after. So maybe they had an argument with someone at work, or maybe they their boss said that they weren't doing a good job. On the other hand, maybe their boss said they were doing a good job, and we would want to kind of understand, does that maybe change whether the vaping is happening or not? And then what happens after that? What's next? Maybe the vaping happens and then the person feels more energized. That maybe is kind of a common experience for people who are doing vaping, and when there's nicotine involved in particular. But we would again sort of try to understand this pathway of behavior. So we're understanding the pathway and the function of behavior in order to interrupt the chain. So maybe here we're thinking about the antecedent as being relevant. So maybe helping that person to cope better when they're either getting into an argument with a coworker, or when their boss is saying they're not doing a good job. So how do they cope instead of going outside to vape during their break? Or the other side of it, that they're experiencing potentially a positive consequence of vaping, the idea that maybe they have more energy. How else could they get more energy? How else could they kind of change this pathway around? So if the function of vaping is to manage stress or get more energy, we want to understand that. And then we want to sort of create an intervention plan to address the function of that behavior and interrupting the chain. So again, I mentioned this idea with example functional analysis, with a child disobeying as maybe being a target behavior problem that a parent would be concerned about. We would, in an assessment that I would be doing with a parent, I would say something like, so, it sounds like your child is really not listening to you. They're really kind of not paying attention, or just really going against what you're saying. Can you tell me when that happens, when that comes up? Really getting a good sense of what it looks like when that parent gives a command. So can you give an example of what you would actually tell your child when you're asking them to do something? So I get a lot of information there, try to understand what those commands are looking like. And when the child is disobeying, I would kind of try to understand, is it every time the parent gives a command the child is disobeying? Is it for certain types of commands? Is it when they give a command in a certain way, like maybe a command where they're yelling, the child is more likely to disobey? So there's a lot of questions I would have about this connection right here, first off. Then I would ask, again, maybe about what happens next. So in some cases, maybe the parent is spanking the child. When they disobey, maybe the parent is trying to reason with the child. Maybe the parent starts to ignore the child. Maybe they yell. There's lots of different ways that the parent could respond when that comes up. Again, so I would have a lot of questions about this piece. And I would, again, do my behavior chain analysis in a more nuanced way, right? Not just kind of thinking about it in terms of this being the only behavior that matters, but the parent spanking the child, if that's the action that's taking place, if the parent is ignoring the child, that might become my focus in that behavior chain analysis. The behaviors kind of keep happening, and we track that behavior chain across time. So I would be then kind of asking more questions. So what happens next after you do that? Getting a lot more information. And then again, understanding again that functional relationship between the child's behavior, between the parent's behavior, and kind of what the function of the behavior is. So so that would be really crucial in terms of this process. And again, we really need a lot of data to be able to do this well. So sometimes relying on retrospective report, like the book talks about, the idea that maybe a parent just coming in and just saying, you know, this is how I think it usually goes. But the more real-time data, the better, because then again, we're sort of being probably more accurate, more valid, more reliable about our understanding of that problem. So that would be one way that as a clinician, I would kind of work with parents to understand. I would give them probably a form that they would take home with them and track across the week after the first visit, where they would be, again, looking at that. And again, I would ask the parent in that next meeting about, you know, do you notice any patterns about what came up in terms of how you responded when the child disobeyed, or times that the child actually did listen, you know, that maybe you weren't paying as much attention to. So there's lots of different questions that we would want to be thinking about here. And again, ultimately, what we're kind of trying to understand here in this functional analysis is, what is a long-term consequence? Is that behavior increasing or decreasing in relation to that antecedent when something is added or subtracted? So again, I mentioned the idea that the idea of self-monitoring, the idea of giving a client a self-monitoring form to fill out can actually have some positive benefits, that it can actually reduce problem behaviors, or can actually improve, you know, increase the likelihood of maybe your target goal behaviors, like eating vegetables, for example, that when I ask you to self-monitor, that you're more likely to actually see more or less of that behavior in the direction that you want it to go. And again, that shows the power of attention, and it shows kind of the different direction that we're kind of working with here. So again, if it's a target problem that we're trying to reduce, we're aiming for punishment. Again, that has a negative connotation or has a bad connotation because we think punishment is something that's done that is like harmful, or you know, something that is really kind of not nice. A punishment is something that is a really negative consequence. But really, again, punishment in behavioral terms really means that in the long run, the behavior is likely to decrease, or the behavior does decrease. So again, we're looking at punishment, and then if we're saying that you're tracking maybe vegetable eating, you know, ideally your behavior is being reinforced. So that would again be what we're looking for there. And in both cases, the antecedent is that we're adding something. We're adding self-monitoring. So we'd either be talking about positive reinforcement if your vegetable eating goes up, or we'd be talking about positive punishment if your snacking behavior goes down, or if your nail biting goes down, whatever behavior you were kind of tracking as part of that self-monitoring. So it would be kind of in these two quadrants, and operant conditioning is at play here. I don't have a ton to say about psychophysiology, aside from saying it's starting to gain some traction. It definitely has a lot of traction, has had a lot of traction in the past 20 years in research in abnormal psychology. Again, I mentioned that more and more researchers in psychopathology, abnormal psychology, are starting to look at underlying mechanisms that are maybe common across different types of mental health issues. And so psychophysiology is one way of getting at the potential mechanisms, either in terms of brain functioning. With EEG, we're looking at the electrical activity. We can sort of see the patterns that are happening when different and people are engaged in different types of activities. And so that would be one way we can track psychophysiology, for example, in terms of heart rate variability. And there's a term or kind of a measure called vagal tone. So part of the vagus nerve that is connected with cardiac health. So researchers are sort of looking at heart rate variability, for example, that you can get from electrocardiogram, kind of pictured here. And basically some different electrodes that are placed on the body that give you a sense of the heart rate. We can get lots of different metrics that way. And those metrics in previous research have been shown to help to predict or be associated with different types of problems, or be associated with mechanisms that are then related to problems. So things like self-regulation, things like, again, attention, things like that. So EEG, for example, has been used a lot in terms of sleep research. I was involved as an undergraduate in research that looked at brain asymmetries in activity, the idea that maybe different parts of the brain are more active than other parts of the brain. And research by John Allen at the University of Arizona and others have shown that people with depression have bigger kind of brain asymmetry that we can pick up with EEG. So I was actually this person here, that's not me, but so this person here who set up the electrode cap for participants in the study and set them up with the different kind of stimuli that they use, which would be like different tasks and things. And I was the one that monitored their data collection as an undergraduate. So this is not used as much right now in terms of real clinical practice, but it is really used in terms of the research that people are doing to understand psychopathology and understand mental health issues that are relevant. So I like that the book kind of brings us up and lets you know that these things are really kind of becoming more and more relevant and important. The things to know are really sort of about EEG, kind of what that's measuring, the idea that it's measuring electrical activity in the brain, for example. And I am, let me just make sure I kind of give the other main things to know from this part of the chapter. Event-related potential is another part in the chapter, which is the idea of basically you sort of present some sort of stimulus. You present like a picture or a task, the person has to do something, and you're tracking their brain waves right around that task. So it's the brain activity related to that event. So that type of work is really active in psychology as well. And again, there's some quite a bit here in terms of EEG and sleep, for example, and sleep waves. You don't need to memorize those different parts, like the different stages of sleep, for example. That's not going to be a huge exam topic. I do think that the notes or the part of the chapter on electrodermal activity is really relevant. The idea of that skin response and measuring sweat glands and kind of skin conductance, skin activity, that is another kind of tool. Biofeedback is another tool that is being used. The idea that it's sort of bringing into attention, into people's attention, what their body is actually doing. So you can get a sense of your heart rate or your respiration, and then you can actually then develop a little bit more control over it. So biofeedback is actually one of the things that's getting some more attention in terms of treatment for different types of psychopathologies. So EEG, electrodermal activity, those are not really built in yet to things that we can do for people, but biofeedback is one of the emerging technologies for actually helping people with treatment, the idea of actually intervening in their life to sort of get better in terms of some type of problem. So I just wanted to make sure that people were aware of kind of the main things that I want you to take from that part of the chapter. But again, just it's an exciting area that is up and coming. And for those of you who are maybe more interested in biology, chemistry, kinesiology, health sciences, then maybe this section is a place where you find yourself interested as well. So that's it for this segment, and we'll talk more about the diagnostic system in the next segment.